Okay, I'd like to introduce Mike Caulfield from Wazoo in Vancouver, which will be speaking on OERs rule.
So I'm Mike Caulfield from WSU Vancouver. I am the director of blended and networked learning there. I work with faculty to create blended instruction, hybrid courses. The title of this presentation is OERs rule, MOOCs DROOL. It's not meant to be just an aspersion on MOOCs. It actually comes from this David Wiley quote here, which reads, "Don't MOOC DROOL support distributed, open online learning, more reflective of what we want, and possibly even worse acting." Now, to some extent, what David is asking us here is to see MOOCs as existing in a slightly expanded universe of options, and I think given this conference, this is one place where people get that. It resonates with me personally because I worked in blended instruction, and in blended learning, we've been watching this space. Really, blended learning has been growing for a decade or so. If you look at these things up here, they have various degrees of openness, right? But I think they serve very similar purposes to the purpose a MOOC serves when it's used in the context of blended instruction. And this is what we're seeing, right? The push to use MOOCs now in blended instruction. They all represent the trend over the past decade or so to push more blended instruction into the digital materials and into the community around those materials. Pearson, for instance, so you'll see publisher resources up here. Pearson doesn't call itself a publisher anymore. Pearson is a digital learning and services corporation, I believe. OLI, 2009, started working with community colleges to put OLI products into community curriculum, community college curriculum. NCAP was doing that in 2000. David Wiley's Kaleidoscope project began moving beyond the idea of open textbooks into the idea of open courseware. So this is a trend that has been going on for some time. XMOOCs didn't appear in an unpopulated space, right? They didn't arrive like the monolith in Kubrick's film 2001, right? You know the monolith that shows up various points in history, and it's just so technically advanced that here we see it jump-starting the evolution of mankind, right? Okay, so point number one, right? XMOOCs are not monoliths, right? They're not. That's not what we're looking at here. Very much the point that George was making in the keynote, that this is a progression that's been happening a long time. XMOOCs are in fact a bit of a latecomer to the blended courseware party. So the question that we need to ask is not whether MOOCs can improve blended learning, right? The question we have to ask is, what do MOOCs provide above and beyond the options that already exist? And that's a somewhat different question. And the answer to that, to me, seems to be that they provide this massive global cohort. Without the cohort, they're really just digital materials. The massive in these MOOCs isn't because the materials are massive. It's not because the tests are extra long. It's actually that global community of students going through roughly the same lesson at the same time. And the mythology of MOOCs is that cohort provides certain peer-to-peer affordances that are not found in those other options that we just looked at, right? This is where we get the stories of the US student that's reaching out to the student in Pakistan or Brazil and getting a 2 a.m. answer to a question. This is why Andrew highlights in this morning's keynote that the average time to get an answer on the forums is 22 minutes. This is the mythology of the MOOC, the affordances of this gigantic peer-to-peer cohort. And the question I want to look into today is it's not whether this makes a difference in general, but when we approach the question of use of MOOCs in a blended context, what does that look like? What does that use look like, and what are the benefits of that use in the drawbacks? So I found some other people that were interested in this. Amy Collier at Stanford, Helen Chen at Stanford. We were able to find 4 instructors, this was about a year ago, we were able to find 4 instructors who were using MOOCs in their classroom. to essentially flip their classroom in one way or another. And what we decided to do was to do something kind of novel, talk to the people that were actually using these MOOCs, find out what they were doing, what worked, what didn't, what they would change, and what they would improve. Additionally, we got some student survey data from 2 of the courses, which the instructors were kind enough to provide us with. And for one of the courses, we were able to get full student interaction records from the Stanford, because they were interacting with the Stanford course. We got the full interaction records of the students, of the 26 students in that course, right? So we're able to see what do they spend their time online doing. Now, the first thing that we found was that the local cohort, right? When I say the local cohort, we're talking about that blended class, right? The local cohort is not being synced with the global cohort, even though they were running the global cohort, this Introduction to Databases MOOC, was running at the same time as these local classes. They were not actually synchronizing, lesson for lesson. So the idea, right, of using a community MOOC, you would think, would be that as the local cohort is going through lesson 1 or 2, this worldwide community is going through lesson 1 or 2, you reach out to your companions and you get help and support. That's actually not what we found at all. We found that instructors in 3 of the cases were actually using archived materials of the course. So they were essentially, even though they said that they were flipping using a MOOC, they were essentially using the MOOC as purely digital resources, right? A little different than OER, except perhaps a little less O. It's a bit of an odd thing, but when we actually talked to the professors, it made a lot of sense. One of the big things is that schedule turns out to matter quite a lot. Start and end dates of colleges are different. Some places are on the quarter system, some places are on the semester system. You may want, as an instructor, to spend the first 3 weeks getting project teams set up, and so you're not going to actually start your material in earnest till week 3. Or you may want to go through the material much more quickly than the MOOC, because your last 3 weeks are usually group projects, right? And so you have to get through it sooner. So the professors needed much more flexibility in the scheduling than they would receive if they tried to sync up directly with the MOOC. The second thing that we found, well, there's another piece of that too, which is actually maybe even a little more important. It's difficult when a MOOC is coming out with lessons week by week. You're the instructor. If it's coming out on Tuesday and you have a class on Thursday, and you've got to build a class around that, that's a little bit stressful. We had one instructor who stayed perfectly in sync for a little bit, but then she hit a patch where her students needed more instruction around a particular issue. So she spent 2 weeks on a module that was supposed to be 1 week in the MOOC, fell a week behind, which, by the way, is yet another reason why you need schedule flexibility. I mean, you can't tell your students, hey, I know you don't understand this. We're moving on, though, because the kids at Stanford get it. That's not going to really fly. She said falling behind a week was the best thing that happened, because now the MOOC would come out a week ahead of when she was going to use it. She had time to reflect and think about what she really wanted to do for that in-class activities, right? The second thing we found, initially heard from the instructors we interviewed, was that the students weren't really using the forums of the MOOC at all, right? In some cases, this is not surprising. To the extent that the class is out of sync, we're out of sync, there's a little less of a buzz to getting in, talking to people that are 3 weeks ahead of you, in the class. It's not quite as exciting. However, even when we looked at the instructor who was in sync, we found, she said that her students were not using the forums at all. The students in the student surveys said they didn't find forums particularly useful. And we decided, okay, well, let's go for 3. Let's actually look at the interaction records and see what the students actually did. So we pulled the 26 interaction records for the 26 students in her class. We looked through those. We did some statistical analysis on them. If you want to see some of the numbers around the statistical analysis, there's an EDUCAUSE article out October that Amy and I wrote with Sharif Halawa. You can look at that if you want some more information. I think the visualization of this, although it may be very confusing at first, it will be explained, actually helps bring home the point a little better. So this is a visualized interaction record of one student, and you'll just have to take my word for it. It's a pretty typical looking record. These black bars here are sessions. So from this black bar to this black bar, that's one session that the student engaged with the materials of the MOOC. These blue bars, and you see these are running together, like this square, this big blue square, is actually, I think, 5 vertical blue bars run together. Each vertical blue bar represents the students accessing or viewing a video from the course. So this student comes in here and then watches something like 4 videos, right? And that's his or her first session. These green, brown, red sorts of things here, these are all different forms of assessment, and the different colors encode whether it's the first attempt, second attempt, successful attempt, non-successful. It doesn't really affect our purposes here. Okay. Does anybody want to guess what can you see the yellow bars out back? Does anybody want to guess what the yellow bars are? The yellow bars are forum visits. Okay. This shows 2 sessions, right? Because you can look at the black bars on each side here and that black bars here. There are 2 sessions out of 44 sessions where this student views the forums. And I'm talking about viewing forums, by the way. I'm not talking about, this is when the student posts. This student actually went to look at the forums twice, right, in this entire course. And that's actually the median use, right? So just in case you think I'm cherry picking a student that just hates forums, the median student visited the forums twice in this course. So we got to thinking, well, that's great, but maybe people in introduction to databases, maybe they just don't use the forums. Maybe this MOOC is not a real forum-focused MOOC. Maybe we haven't stumbled onto a difference between blended and what we were calling unaffiliated use. Maybe this is just a difference in the way this particular MOOC runs. Okay, this here is, I'm going to show you a fairly typical record of what we call completed. Now there's a little bit of a bias here. We chose random completers. They were people that had watched 75% of the videos or more, right? So it wouldn't make sense to choose the person that dropped out the first week. That's not going to give us a decent comparison. So this is what an unaffiliated completer looks like. Okay? Not only are you seeing, they actually had more forum sessions than the students had total sessions. You see repeatedly they're coming in for sessions, and the only thing they're doing in that session is looking at the forum, right? Completely different pattern of use. And we, of course, don't know how much this person posted or didn't post. I mean, a very different pattern of use, you know, from, again, this. Okay? So it might be tempting to see this as a failure of, yeah, we can say this. It might be tempting to see this as a failure of either the design of the blended instruction, the design of the MOOC, that these blended students were not engaging with the forums. But again, when we dug deeper in the interviews, when we looked at the student surveys, what we found was, you know, I'm sorry for the cliche, but this was not so much a bug, but it was a feature. The students in this class were heavily engaged with one another. The professor said she had never seen the students work together in a class to this extent before. They were in the hallways, you know, talking with one another about these problems so much that she actually started to get some borderline worries that the students were just cheating and passing around answers. But she found that they actually did fairly well on the assessments that she put together, or well enough that wasn't the issue. And that's what we want, right? We want the students making those connections between them and their classmates, utilizing office hours, you know, finding ways to bond with the people on campus. It's one of the biggest predictors of success, retention, all these things. So, you know, this works in that sense, right? This worked in that sense. We don't necessarily want to be pushing them. The online forum to them is redundant, right? It's redundant, it's a lower quality set of interaction that doesn't really do anything beyond what they're getting locally. So, back to our original question, you know, what are MOOCs in practice adding to the blended courseware toolbox, above and beyond some of these other options that we see, including traditional open materials. My sense is that the features that make a MOOC, right, an XMOOC a MOOC, an XMOOC an XMOOC, don't really add much to the blended classroom, right? Those features, that global cohort, that massive global cohort, doesn't really add much to the blended classroom. At least in this particular instance, and I'm willing to guess that you can extrapolate that to at least some other instances. There are broad differences in discipline. I don't mean to paper them all over, but I would be very surprised if we didn't see the same behavior in a lot of other classes as well. And it might be tempting to see this as, well, so what? They don't use those forums, right? And I call it the one type of analysis, the cable TV channel analysis. You have 100 channels, you watch 5, but it's not like the 95 channels you don't watch are harming your experience, right? So they don't use the forums, big deal. Except, right? Except that in this case, that synchronized cohort, that large synchronized cohort that you aren't using in the class still has a huge impact on the design of the product. Because that synced cohort requires one centralized instance of the class running on one schedule, right? And a lot of the frustrations we heard from the instructors using the MOOCs in their classroom were about issues of this centralization. They didn't have direct access to the student data in the MOOC, right? Because it exists over in Palo Alto, right? They weren't able to customize the schedule, because again, it's being run out of Palo Alto. So you're getting the downsides, right, of centralization, but you're not really getting the upsides. So now it looks like in the recent news with Coursera, moving it very heavily into blended instruction, partnering with all these universities, it looks like they are going to some extent, decentralize some of that, and I think that this is just inevitable. We've swung so far to centralization in this current XMOOC model that we're going to have to swing a little bit back towards local control. And that's not to say that local control wins, it just means we need a better balance, right? And the balance here, at least for blended instruction, the balance here is no good. I will say that we found one thing in the MOOCs that I hadn't really seen in other stuff that we had worked with, and that is that the experience of the instructors, most of the instructors had gone through the MOOC they were going to teach before they taught it. So they took it the first time it came around, and then they used it in class. And one of the things we did find with the MOOC was that experience that the instructors had of going through with a cohort of other students in it, being a student in it, seeing someone model how to teach it. That piece of it was actually profound and transformative to the people that participated in it. And that's a piece that maybe I think we can learn a little more from. You can imagine a scenario where you have people going through this educational experience as a cohort of instructors, as a global cohort of instructors on a non-time-based schedule, like on a looser schedule. But then taking that instance, moving it to their campus, in teaching that in a more decentralized way. These are really short sessions. I didn't even start my timer, so I told myself again and again I was gonna. So I'll stop here and see if anybody has any questions about this. Don't be shy. I dumped a lot on people. Yes. Go ahead.
So your last point about the impact of taking a MOOC from the teacher perspective and how profound that was, and then the greater collaboration of the students in the hybrid course. I wonder how much of an influence do you think just the teacher doing something different?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Not the MOOC at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't think that there's some MOOC superpower that we're seeing here. But certainly it is, you're changing the practice the teacher has, and they're rethinking what's important to them. So one of the things that we saw was that about halfway through the semester, of course, say semester, it's actually a quarter, one of the instructors realized that she was giving out the same test that she had given out before she used the MOOC, but that she was actually focusing on very different sorts of skills than she had been teaching before in this class. In that process of thinking through, well, what would a test look like that actually tested the sorts of stuff we're doing in the flipped classroom? Yeah, that's the sort of thing that you want to spark in instructors. And I absolutely agree. I think the thing is, though, that you can get that through using other materials. Someone, yes.
Right. So my question is about the scale and the diversity.
Yeah.
So when you have a cohort that's global,
Yeah.
You have diversity.
Yeah.
So in a database course, for example, that may not add much. But for other types of courses, where sort of it's more, in a traditional classroom, it would be more of a seminar style course.
Yeah.
You could imagine the diversity and the diversity of thought adding a lot of value.
Yeah.
So in that case, you would think a distributed flip could actually gain a lot by having a cohort that is in fact large.
So I co-created a psychology MOOC that ran on Canvas Network last summer. The question, in case you didn't hear it, the question is, well, what about, for some classes, the diversity of that global cohort is actually a benefit. How does that figure in? In the psychology MOOC, one of the things we found, it was a smaller MOOC. There was about 300 students from around the world because, it was Keene State College, not Harvard. And that sort of thing did figure in because you would have people who would be parents of children with autism and stuff like that. And in the context of the forum, they could bring some of these experiences into the mix. What's interesting about that, though, is it's a different conceptualization of what the forum is for. I mean, what Andrew was talking about this morning when he says you get the answer in 22 minutes, he's not saying, well, someone responds to your thoughts about your kid's autism in 22 minutes. He's saying you get the answer to the problem or the solution to the problem. And that's generally been posed as the big advantage of the cohort is really just tutoring. But I agree that there's a lot of potential in the use of cohorts for things that don't look like peer-to-peer tutoring, but actually look more like a humanities-style discussion. Yeah?
Comment and question. So I work at a community college, and one of the concerns that we have is that we're sort of being put in the position of being asked to, in some cases with MOOCs at least, be facilitators of somebody else's content.
Yeah.
Right? And we feel like, well, we've been kind of, we think it's interesting that Stanford discovered open access education, right? We're at a community college. We've been doing that for a while. But the question is, some of the issues, I wanted you to speak to some of the problems that maybe instructors have found when you have content that is created, that is divorced from the local institutional context.
Yeah.
Right? So something at Stanford, and it's supposed to be sort of facilitated in Salt Lake or Georgia or wherever, and how that sort of presents certain challenges.
Yeah, I'm actually putting together a thing for, if anybody's going to Sloan in Orlando, I'm actually putting together a workshop on this very issue. Actually, I'm sorry, it's not at Sloan, it's going to be at EP4 online next year. But we saw there were a lot of issues. And one of these issues is that we tend to think, well, it's just a video textbook, right? How is it any different than a textbook? The textbook doesn't undermine your authority as a professor. How would a video undermine your authority? But they're actually quite different things, right? When you see a particular professor, either in a particular office or talking to a particular class that you're not in, that experience is very different than a textbook that's been written for a broad audience. I mean, it can feel to the students like the warmed over, leftovers of an Ivy League education. It can, if using some open materials sometimes feels to your students like you're passing the buck. Using videos of someone lecturing can feel to the students like it's a complete punt, right? And so one of the things that we learned from talking to these faculty was explaining to the students, why you were doing it the way you were doing it, very clearly helped. And then the other thing too is don't take, dialogue with the videos. That is, when someone shows one way to do something, make sure that you say, so Jennifer Whittam in that way showed us this way to approach this problem. I want to show you another way that I find helpful, or another explanation that worked for me. so that you're not just there and this person's doing all, the knowledge transfer and you're doing all the flipped instruction, but that it feels like there's a dialogue between you and the material, which is what some professors have learned to do with textbooks as well. Another question, we have a couple minutes, 2 minutes maybe? Someone has a 2-minute question. No? Yeah.
Did you get from the research from the professors any sense of just the user experience in terms of using the content from these archived MOOCs?
Yeah.
Did they plug it into their own LMS or?
No, they didn't, and that was one of the frustrations, right? So they used it, they just had the students go to it and use it. And through an agreement with the instructor could sometimes pull some aggregate stats and send them back to the instructor so that the instructor just knew if the students had done something. But there was no real-time access to the stats. It was very periodic that they would receive updates. And of course, they couldn't actually make any adjustments to the material. And again, I think that this is one of the things that if we move more towards local control and away from the centralization, we could still have some of these benefits, but we would allow the flexibility and the access to student data. Which, I mean, if we say we're about that, like how are we going to, if we want instructors to actually take action on the data that they're collecting from students and have that impact their teaching, putting this huge loop into receiving that data where the instructors are receiving it periodically, it doesn't really make any sense. If we're going to talk about retention strategies where we see student grades across an entire student information system, again, pulling one class out and saying, oh, well, this isn't part of the student information system, it's not going to go into the course signals piece or whatever. I mean, again, it's at odds with the rhetoric about MOOCs is at odds with the rhetoric we have about data-driven instruction. We've got to somehow reconcile that. All right, so that's I guess that's it, right? Is that it? All right, thank you for coming.